All right, welcome to the next lecture. Real interesting topic today. One thing we know from the lipid lectures is that carbohydrates in large part regulate fat metabolism. But carbohydrates can be important for high intensity performance, especially when that performance is power related. So what we're going to talk about is if someone, one route is to go ketogenic dieting. But if you're not going to go ketogenic dieting and you want carbs to be a part of your life, what's the threshold amount of carbohydrates you need to take in for performance effects and still lose fat? Well, one thing you want to know is this. Just a little background and review. The PCR, or phosphocreatine ATP system, dominates about 0 to 10 seconds of all-out work. So you can see here, from 0 to really 5 seconds, you can see that PCR system's dominating. By 10 seconds, glycolysis and PCR are equal, and by 20 seconds, glycolysis dominates. So, with high-intensity exercise that's past 20 seconds, or really past 10 seconds, the dominant fuel source is glycogen. So, just to show you this, glycogen levels after 1 6-second all-out 100% maximal sprint decreases by 13%, and after a 30-second sprint decreases by 25%. So you can drain glycogen really fast. The response isn't linear. Okay, we see 1 sprint 13%, 10 sprints 36%. And this suggests that with repeated sprints, it becomes more of a strength endurance bout instead of a pure power bout, or a power endurance bout instead of a pure power bout, which means you're relying on other fuel sources. If you look at weightlifting, weightlifting depletes glycogen by a typical range of 25 to 40%, with an average of 30% when performing 3 to 20 sets. We know smaller body parts get depleted quicker than larger body parts. So man, 25 to 40 millimolar decrease. Clearly, carbs are the preferred fuel for high-intensity exercise, but how many carbs do we need to consume in a given day when attempting to lose fat and maintain performance? We've already talked again about the possibility of using ketogenic dieting, but if you're not willing to do that, what's another route? So if we look at, or try and answer the question, when is glycogen quote-unquote limiting, we need to see what are the remaining glycogen levels after a given session. Well, you still have 60 to 80% of your glycogen stores after high-volume weight training. Clearly, for most high-volume weight training sessions, glycogen is not limiting if you start off with a full tank. 10 all-out sprints, you still have 64% of your glycogen left. So it's likely not limiting for resistance training or moderate volume sprinting. However, after a hockey or soccer game, you might only have 25 to 45% of your glycogen remaining. So it may be limiting for hockey players or intermittent athletes, given enough playing time. If you're a backup and you're not playing as much, then that may not be the case. So practical applications, if you're a bodybuilder or physique athlete, or a pure strength athlete who's constrained by a weight category, then carbs are typically not limiting during a training session, although they are essential to performance. When I say they're not limiting, we're assuming that you're starting off with a normal carbohydrate state. it's going to range at 80 to maybe 120 millimolars. If you're an intermittent athlete like a hockey player or soccer player, carbs may be limiting. So we can conclude by saying limiting carbs can be done for physique and strength athletes, but this can only be done in the off-season for intermittent athletes. And for fat metabolism, you want to basically meet the demands of the activity without exceeding the demands of the activity. And that's key. So we just want carbohydrates as a fuel source. Beyond that, we're not looking for anything. This is looking at the replenishment of glycogen after passive recovery following glycogen depleting exercise. You notice a dose-dependent response where, for example, for strength power athletes, you're replenishing anywhere from about 20 millimolars a day when you're consuming about 300 grams of carbs per day. If you're about 150 grams of carbs, only 5 millimolars. So we see anywhere from 3 to 5 grams of carbs, which is anywhere from 275 to 250 to 400 grams of carbs for your typical individual. We see that you're replenishing anywhere from 20 to 30 millimolars. So if we look at data from Costel and Burke, we know 2 grams of carbs per kilogram leads to inadequate replenishment and may lead to slight depletion, but maintenance of daily function. Like this guy here, he doesn't need more than 2 grams per kilogram. In fact, he probably should be ketogenic dieting. But maintenance, but for a 180-pound guy, this would come out to about 160 grams of carbs. At 3 to 5 grams per kilogram, it would likely take 2 days, about 20 to 40 millimolars, to replenish a heavy leg workout. So let's say you got an 80 kilogram guy. They would need 240 to 400 grams of carbs per day. That's likely more than adequate if you're a bodybuilder or powerlifter or power athlete such as a baseball player. And this seems to be supported by a number of studies. This is the impact of a carbohydrate restriction / slight depletion on glycogen replenishment. So you can see muscle glycogen before and then muscle glycogen after. Okay? So one thing I want to point out is this. All these people did, these people were sedentary, and they restricted their carbohydrates drastically. But after 7 days, if you look, their muscle glycogen levels were still fairly intact. In fact, they still had the majority of their muscle glycogen. What this suggests is that you will not essentially deplete muscle glycogen unless you use it. Okay? It will remain relatively intact. However, one thing I want to point out is that the rate of glycogen storage in the restricted group was way higher than the normal group. So that's very, very important to point out. Why is that important? Well, we see slight, and that's all that study showed was slight, glycogen depletion. What happens is it partitions glucose towards muscle. Also elevates fat metabolism. Okay, so we see here, this is that same study, days on a carbohydrate-restricted diet, this fatty acid in the blood. Notice fatty acids are greater in the blood during the restricted period. So basically what this is saying is if slight depletion is beneficial, and you think about it, if you're weight training, glycogen is not really limiting, it may be better to stay toward the lower end of the range, 2 out of 3 days, and the moderate end of the 3rd day. That's around 240 to 320 grams of carbs for 80 kilogram guy trying to lose body fat. If they're maintenance, it's another story. They may go all the way from the 240 to 400 grams with only 1 day on the low end. So what we're seeing here is essentially it's a ketogenic diet. So what they did was they had a ketogenic diet compared to a high carb diet. And what you're looking at is essentially muscle glycogen levels. The blue is starting pre-sprint with 7 grams of carbs per kilogram, and the brown is 0.4 grams of carbs per kilogram. We see post-sprint, glycogen is obviously lower in the ketogenic diet. If you look to the right at end pedaling frequency, notice that the frequency of pedaling is greater in the glycogen group, which is the white open bars with the diagonal slashes. Those sprinting frequencies are higher than the CHO diet. However, I do want to point out, if you recall from our study, when you reintroduce carbohydrates, this seemed to be nullified. But what about super high? We know that for power output, moderate versus low carb, moderate's generally better when you're glycogen depleted. If you're repleted, it's a whole different story. What about very high carbs versus moderate carbs? This study compared 525 grams of carbs, or 7 grams per kilogram, versus 312 grams of carbs, or 4 grams per kilogram. Now that falls within the 3 to 5 that we discussed. And they looked at sprint time to exhaustion at 125% VO2 max. That's booking. If you look, the moderate carbohydrate group had less muscle glycogen than the high, both pre and post sprint. However, there was no difference in performance. No difference at all in performance. So the high did not benefit over moderate. In this study, what they did was they had subjects perform a glycogen depleting sprint protocol, followed by 2 days of 100 grams of carbs per day versus a normal carbohydrate diet, which is 300 to 500 grams. So it's somewhere within that range we talked about of the 3 to 5 grams of carbs. Their total volume over 3 sets of 60% 1 RM intensity was higher in the high carb than the low carb. So we know short-term depletion of glycogen does impair total volume. In obese people, this is a real good study here by Dr. Lehman. They gave a ratio of 1.5 grams of carbs for every gram of protein. So if you had 150 grams of carbs, you'd have 100 grams of protein. That 1.5 gram to 1 ratio resulted in greater fat loss to muscle loss ratio than a 3.5 to 1 ratio. And the 3.5 to 1 is what the American Dietetic Association recommends. However, for fat loss, that's probably not ideal. If you look here at the ratio, this is the ratio of fat loss to muscle loss. The protein group is the group that's on top. You can see the protein group lost more fat than the carbohydrate group. So just changing the ratio of carbs to protein does have benefits. So in conclusion, with the data we have to date, it appears that for the combination of optimal performance in the gym and fat loss, that 3 to 5 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight given an adequate protein intake is ideal for resistance and power athletes. However, intermittent athletes may need to use this strategy in the off-season and likely stay in the upper range of CHO intake. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.